And so, and that's a good, it sounds like a good contribution and article. And Mike mentioned it's a review article versus a research article. And so there are these two categories, and I made some slides of this too, because we're in part of this, we're starting to dive into mechanisms and things, and that causes us to start leaning toward science articles. Some of these are not, we've been looking at some things that are not necessarily science articles. There would be like our website, things like that. That's fine. So there's a couple of major types of science writing, and one is called a primary research article, where new knowledge is discovered through experiments. And so there'll be graphs in there showing new data. Here's what we learned. And then a review article is where scientists in the field will say, gosh, we gotta have somebody pull this together, new understanding. So pull a bunch of relevant, related research articles. Those also will have data graphs, but those are really typically from another paper, from a primary research article. It's rare that a review article happens to bring up new data. It can happen, but that's kind of the rough thing. And so in learning this stuff, we kind of want to be in a happy balance between a review article level of understanding, like, well, what is this and how does it work, and a nuts and bolts detailed primary research article, both for our exams, and also our capstone paper project. For our exams, we would be leaning more toward take-home messages and review level stuff. It's unlikely that we would be like, and I'm just going to recreate this graph or this data from this article, like that. But yeah, that's good. And so then, can I just? Oh, Luke, do you want to add something?
I have read a paper when I was first doing the capstone projects about eels in Maine, and looking at the behavior of their, like the timing of their migration as their developmental plasticity in response to the environment they're in. Kind of seems to be in line with what you were.
Yeah, I think I read the same paper because it talks about I can't remember any of the terms they use, but it's essentially long-term versus short-term memory, and how it was seasonally related to the migration.
Oh, cool.
I can't remember what the word they used. A specific
Potentiation?
phrase. So cool. What's that?
Potentiation?
No, it was a phrase I'd never heard before. That it just
Okay.
that
Yeah.
they used in the paper.
Yeah.
But it was about eels and how they migrated, and it was a specific type of learning.
Yeah.
So it's not. I can't imagine there's a ton of papers
Yeah,
about
hold
that.
on,
Yes. Yeah. And so Emily, just follow up for everyone about development versus physiology. So another way to think about it would be to say, okay, so development or physiology describes everything that happens in any living cell. And so there would be some cells that have all cells would have this physiology, but there'd be some cells that you're like, yeah, they're not really doing much development. So that's one way of thinking about it. So single-celled organisms are not considered to do very much development. They have some changes, and we talked a little bit about those, but a real single-celled organism, it definitely has, cellular physiology, but it lacks development. So that's another way to think about it. Then another way to think about it is how, physiology and development are both a couple of old fields, and how do people distinguish them? So, for example, an author of a textbook, and what they would do is they would say, well, what are some really important principles and features of development that are not really so significant for physiology, and vice versa? And it's pretty hard to find examples of physiology that aren't important for development, because all cells, when they're alive, they're doing this physiology. So physiology is all irrelevant. But there are good examples in development where it's really significant for development and the history of evolution of developmental processes on Earth, but it doesn't stand out as much for physiology. And a good example of that would be genomic equivalence. The fact that all cells have all the genes is really significant for development, and seeing what development is, what it means, and the evolution of developmental processes and diversities like that. So that would be another way. And you know, you would start out with big ones where you're like, I bet they don't talk about this in a physiology course, you know, but we talk about it a lot in development. And you know, a person would start out with some grand distinctions where you'd be like, I think you should take both physiology and development courses because we talked about some different features of life that really kind of pop up as super significant and super understandable from one perspective or the other. And then, you know, we'd start drilling into some examples where we'd be like, well, tanning, I don't, you know, that's kind of, you know, maybe not so easy to decide. We should learn about that in a physiology course or a development course, like that, yeah? So, for example, skin, we should learn about the different cell types, right? Because, you know, we're just saying keratinocytes, but there are a variety of different skin types, sweat glands, you know, hair, you know, cells and things like that, right? So in just the epidermis alone, there would be really important reasons to look, we're going to talk about that in development, or we'll talk about that in physiology. And so now we'll sort of head back to the tanning story because I think it's good for us to absorb it. But also, does anybody want to add, I want to add a little bit as we head back to it, but does anybody want to add anything to how we're ranging right now in this discussion? And you're welcome to. And so just to head back to this tanning example and just to think about it, and you know, and maybe you'll decide it's not an example that you would want to go after, you know, because you'd be like, you know, it seems like it's, you know, kind of down in the weeds like that. But let's absorb it. And so, you know, my understanding would be that our ancestors, right, were in Africa. That's the evidence, and they were covered in hair. They were primates covered in hair. And then our more recent ancestors started to have a lot less hair. And so in Africa, lots of sun exposure, and so evolution of dark, you know, permanently dark skin pigmentation. Then some ancestors left Africa to go to less sunny locations, right? And Ashton said, why you think, because it takes energy to make protein, so if you're not really using the dark melanin skin in an environment with less sun, maybe you're covering up with, you know, animal skins, probably would lose it, you know, either use it or lose it. My understanding is another reason is that a dark body loses heat faster. So like a dark car gains heat faster in the sun, but in the shade it loses that heat faster than a lighter colored car would be. So my understanding is it was actually a selective advantage to be a lighter skin pigment in a colder climate because you would radiate less heat. So just to say that, and so then we get to that, you're right, well, light skin, and then we get to the situation where, then this light skin ancestor could have, I would think of it as probably seasonal sun exposure, right? So long-term, you know, shifts in seasons, so that would be adaptive advantage to have changing pigment that matches sun exposure, probably initially seasonally. So winter, short day length up there, you know, in the cooler climates, but also covering up probably, you know, less like that, maybe less activity, right? Less just activity, hiding out in a cave, trying to stay warm. And so, but then sun and back out, you know, with long day lengths that matched, you know, ancestors in Africa under very bright skies and a lot of DNA damage. So I think that seems to me kind of the evolutionary ancestry of where we got to this, where light-skinned folks would have a kind of plasticity, and maybe we would decide it's more physiological or more developmental. One of the things also to kind of keep going back to Emily's questions is, well, let's take a look at the pathways and see if they are pathways that we run into, you know, and when we're talking other physiological stories, or are they sometimes pathways that pop up when we're like, oh yeah, now we can understand this because we've learned a lot about developmental pathways. So that's another way to think about, you know, gently distinguishing between physiology and development is, are these pathways one that a student would have learned something about and more likely in you know, an A&P type physiology, an anatomy course, or more development? But again, you know, we don't want to derail ourselves, you know, and be like, phew, I can't get anything out of this because we gotta, you know, try to decide which is which. So let's just talk back through this again so we can absorb it, right? So UV damage is where we were. Yeah, and it's great. This is good. So UV damage is a signal that gets interpreted by this pathway that includes P53. So are you saying activation of P53 is also then on a pathway to tanning? Or is that two different separable paths? DNA damage leads to P53 because then is it a transcription factor that directly activates the big protein that gives rise to the hormone or the enzyme tyrosinase?
Eventually.
Yeah. Okay, so just start over with DNA damage. P53 gets activated, and then what did you say?
And then it goes to the nucleus. It's a transcription factor.
Yeah.
It causes transcription of genes related to handling sun exposure, like apoptotic factors, like inflammation, and also the POMC gene, which is made into the hormone that eventually goes to the melanocytes that causes another secondary signaling pathway, or like a signal transduction, or what am I looking for? Cascade, that upregulates tyrosinase.
Yeah, which is the metabolic pathway to synthesize melanin,
Yes.
right? So we're going to get melanin out of that as one of the enzyme steps in that feature. All right, and so we have kind of a two-step pathway because we have two cell types involved, one that gets DNA damage, and it's going to want to communicate that to another cell that's a pigment cell, maybe next to it. So it's going to make that some signals to communicate for the other cell to make this tyrosinase. Yep. Yeah. And yeah, I agree. You know, a person could come down and you like argue, it sounds more like a physiological pathway. That's fine, or more of a developmental pathway. You know, say like, you know, great. You know, I accept that. You know, I don't. Yeah. You know, I don't want to say, oh, I kind of feel this way or that way about it, because I think it's fine to just be on the fence about that. But it's a really satisfying pathway to see an environmental factor affecting phenotype like that. So it's a good example, you know, of the specific mechanisms of this pathway. It includes activation of transcription factor, a new gene expression, includes signaling between cells like that, and then activation of metabolic pathway to make changes like that. The changes are non-permanent, right? So fair-skinned people tan, and then their tan fades like that, right? I think that fits in well with what I described as, I think, you know, the natural selection history of how we got this way, like that. You know, how the human species across the globe got this way. So I think that's really cool. I think it's cool like that. But again, you know, I understand that somebody would say, yeah, I conclude that's kind of more of a physiology story. And I often, like, I'm a scientist who has to sleep on things, you know, and kind of process that and see if I really have an opinion of what I think that is. So, you know, even if I had opinion, I'd hold off, but I don't even have an opinion. But that's okay, you know, it's okay for people to say, yeah, one way or the other, that's absolutely fine. What didn't come up, you know, here is we didn't identify any sort of familiar faces from a developmental biology course, you know, like, oh, it's a Wnt signaling pathway, you know, like that would make us lead toward, oh, it's really a developmental process like that, yep. For example, you know, all of us, you know, members of the species have the players on this pathway. Everybody's got P53, everybody's got tyrosinase like that, you know. And but they are connected in this way, you know, that would have had to evolve. Yep. So yeah, so I think it's really a good one to talk about, although it might not be a classic example, you know, of a developmental pathway like that. Okay. So more comments from you about, you know, what you found here, without, you know, hesitating, because you're like, oh, maybe not everybody thinks this is a great example. You know, it's a great example for us to absorb. Yeah.
I'm taking some psychic damage.
Yeah, I know, that can happen, right? Yep, yeah.
I don't know, because I was also confused about what you would be okay with as a topic, and we had that conversation about tissue plasticity, and now I'm confused again.
Because we talked about it for immune system function and your
Yes.
your capstone
Because I
project.
asked you if that had to be developmental, and you said it didn't really.
Well, yeah, and we should keep talking about it because so, and Ashton's really interested in the immune system. Immune system is constantly redeveloping. So it's a good example of this extreme version of the idea that maybe learning is a developmental process. Well, the immune system is constantly learning and restarting and relearning, like that. So it's a really good example, and I just need to talk with you to fit, kind of help guide toward examples that would better be like, okay, because there's a lot of physiology and immune system we're ready to fight right now, Yeah, but so we should keep talking about it. And again, I've had students in the past, and they picked a topic and they've gone down the path, and I talked to them about it, and I felt that they did a great job in the course, got an A, and everything's great. But the whole time I'm thinking, oh man, this is just not an example that I'm going to talk about in class next year. Some of the talks about in class next year, because they come up, right? We talked to some last week where I'm like, oh my God, those are such good topics, and in mentioning topics, I'm never complimenting or criticizing anybody. I'm just saying that those come up, and I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good one, like that, or that's a good one, but it doesn't lead us into a kind of a clear thing. So yeah, and so you're going down that pathway, super enjoy it, but I'll keep talking to you about ways, because a lot of times what happens is that working scientists, working biologists tend to have a really good appreciation of physiological mechanisms, because a lot of the topics of development that really emerge when a student starts learning about development, they're new topics. So if you look at the writing and the perspective of the writers, a lot of times they're not really appreciating that, right? So it's good. We just want we want to learn biology, and in this class, we want to kind of try to lean it towards some of this new stuff, new perspectives, new views of how things are happening like that. But yeah, so again, let's keep talking. Yeah, definitely, but not in a way where I'm just going to be like, start over, geez, like that, like I know it's finals week, but whatever, get out of here, I'll give you an incomplete. You'll just have to be busy all summer. Yeah, it's not that. And it's true for everybody. Just keep talking about it as you go, because you're going down rabbit holes, and I might say, oh, that's a fine rabbit hole to go down, but I wouldn't have that be your permanent den for your project, fine, like that. So we'll definitely do that. But anyway, so yes, psychic damage, yeah,
Will you close this?
I've
I'm still
experienced
taking
it.
psychic
Well, that
damage.
yellow cell is having some psychic damage, and you guys can all see that. So that's why I kept it up there, because there are several students sitting around in that sort of curved rectangle shape, and then we have Ashton just psychically damaged, right, like that, right? Yeah, and me too. Yeah, I'm usually in that state. Yeah, but it's a good. So I'm saying it's a good example to bring up, and don't hesitate. If you run into something like that, bring it up, and we'll hash it out. Like that. So it's a good one. Questions, comments, additions to that? Here's one. So we talked about that weasel that changes its hair color. Well, that's the same thing, seemingly, like that. It is making a hair product, so it's got to molt, it's got to go through a molting process. But, that I showed that because it's a striking example. But yeah, that one also kind of is like, And for me, some of the times it's that, well, we're down at the level of just what's this skin cell doing? What's this, hair follicle doing? Like that. So, yep, Madison.
Does the thinking about like a comparison between those two examples, does the pathway that we're examining matter? Because if I'm thinking about like the developmental aspect of it, I wanna get a better understanding of like, the systems in place are different, like the system for tanning and the system for that hair change are different, and I don't know if one would be like quote unquote more correct to examine closely and have as like something you commit to memory for the class, because what goes into that process is different.
Yeah, yeah. So I agree, and it's another example where I don't think we need to. I think those are both fine examples, and I think that like Ashton started out. Let's see. You said you picked this one because it was a good one to learn about, right? And that's a good attitude. And so I would say, with that attitude in mind, what's a good one to learn about? I wouldn't pick either of those as my capstone project, because I just don't think it would be as valuable a learning experience in getting a chance to see these new understanding, appreciation, and developmental biology that have come up, and see how it's really affecting fields that seem very far away, ecology, like that, right? Like that. So that's that case, and but if a person finds a topic and brings it to class, that's great. I want to learn about it, like that, partly as an instructive example of, well, bringing up questions about what are we talking about, what's this or that. That's a good thing. If student ends up driving down that pathway for their capstone and they get it done and they get all the pieces together, great, that's fine, like that. The capstone projects for this course are easier to do if a student picks something that is a thing where you're like, oh my gosh, look at that animal go through that diapause state, because that's a totally different thing, where you'd be like, well, yeah, there are physiological changes going on, but you're like, well, yeah, because they have to have cellular physiology going on, but they're making these really grand shifts in the plan for how they grow up or grow old or grow a shape. Yep, yeah. But again, don't be like, oof, man, I'm really stuck on that. So Ashton, don't get stuck on this for your project, but keep talking to me about it, because I'll say like that, Or if you're picking the brain, not picking the brain, choosing the brain, or behavior and things like that, keep talking to me about that, because I would lean toward synaptic plasticity for our course versus just what people call synaptic strength, which can change just how strongly the signal moves on, right?
So
yeah.
So that's for like the capstone.
Yeah.
But for like the test,
yeah,
which I think your question was more geared
yeah,
towards, both of those examples, you could ask a question on the test, give me an example of the environment changing the phenotype. And both of these would be excellent examples of answering that question.
Well, the answer is kind of no, because there would be other examples for every one of the questions, because the question is not just going to be give me an example, but give me an example that illustrates the principles of what we're learning about. And so there would be an example where it would be hard for the student to write about those examples and really fit them into developmental processes. Yep, but
So those wouldn't be good examples then?
No, not so good.
Okay.
There would be better examples, because we're not seeing a really clear role for big developmental changes happening. Like that, yeah. So it's good. But again, I wouldn't be like, dang it, I gave Ashton's example on the test, and I'm not going to come back and be like, oh yeah, no good. Because again, I don't want to get stuck on what if we run into an example that's a little bit hard or very hard for us to distinguish.
So
yeah,
during the course of class,
yeah,
I told Luke, he was like, oh, what's going to be on the test? I was like, Dave will tell us the 10 questions that will be on the test. during the course of class.
Yeah.
Multiple times.
Yeah.
And he's given the examples that he goes over and mentions every class. Those are what he's gonna ask us.
Yeah.
Well,
And I have
yeah.
them in orange in my book, senescent induction, so aging. There's gonna be a question about aging. Maybe not on this test, but on the final. But yeah, he'll.
Yeah.
I've taken many courses with Dave. He's told us everything that's gonna be on the test.
This is my first day for
Yeah.
this.
Yeah, well,
He's gonna pay
and
attention
so,
to the things he
but
mentions every
it's,
time.
and
Yeah.
again, you know, that's a very good point, and so has the author of the chapters we read in that book, right? Is they're bringing up these courses where, the fish is changing sex, you know, like that, and so that would be a developmental pathway, right?
The nematode.
Yeah,
Mhm.
Yep, that's a good example.
yeah,
He's
yeah.
mentioned that 10
Yeah,
times.
and it's, you know, I mean, that's, I'd say, part of being a student is to, like, see, that's probably a really good example, like that.
When Dave says story of, write down the thing he says story of after, that's what's gonna be on the test.
This is very insightful, thank you.
Yeah, yeah, and we're talking about a lot of great examples, and those would be, I would say, you know, again, you know, that could come up in a person's capstone. I would like it to have some more, you know, more examples of development that would reveal more features of our course and the principle of development. And
Oh.
so I would say, yeah, I would just, as a student, I would lean toward that, not in a scared way or not with psychic duress and damage, but just being like, yeah, you know, because it would be a better, I'll just say as a side note, last night I was out dancing because there's really good live music here, and people yell at me about stuff and call me Professor Dave because some people heard that I was because I'm in front dancing like a hippie. And so people ask me science questions, like about what do you do, what's your research on? So last night I was explaining to people, and I picked really good examples. I do research on caterpillars. I made a woman cry last night explaining how cool they are by an example, you know, at a show, you know, and she's just like, wow, God, man, I love it. You know, life is so awesome. I wish I could, you know, go back to school and be a biologist, right?
Is this going to be?
Because I picked big examples. I just was picking big examples. I wasn't being like, look, this is kind of a nuts and bolts thing. I was like, look at this, and you know, and whoa, yeah. Sorry, Ashton. Yes.
I don't see how this is different from like the lac operon, which is something that you've talked about.
Right.
Because
Right.
that's inducible whenever.
Right. Yeah. So that's a good point. And I would say, well, yeah, and it's a good point because it goes back to that example where I distinguish between multicellular organisms and single-celled organisms, with single-celled organisms featuring very little development. But every cell has physiology, so cellular physiology. And the lac operon occurs in a bacteria, and so it does change its phenotype, but it's changing the phenotype of an individual cell and not really a developmental process. Yeah, but again, use it. Just use it, you know, because Ashton has an attitude like me, I think, with regard to all this stuff. And if I was in Ashton's place, I would intentionally use these examples on exams and just push it. You know, like we talked about the lac operon, and I want to talk about melanin on the exam. Go for it. That'd be great. I'll be great. You know, and then we can discuss it, and it will be a learning experience. But I'm not going to give you like an F where you're like, dang it. You know, you're using these examples that are not classics like that. That'd be great. Yes. Yeah. But Mike is right
you
too.
You can argue that this
Yeah.
is like, because I went back and forth during us talking whether or not it's developmental
Yeah.
or physiological,
Yeah.
and I think you could argue that it's developmental. And if you can argue that it's developmental, whatever example you use, like convincingly, not just be like this is developmental, but like if you can argue, which
Yeah.
it seems like you can.
You just did, yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
So
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah. So, yeah. I'm hoping to not discourage anybody about these things. And it's just natural that, you know, the book author or me, I try to pick examples that are illustrative and dramatic like that. That's good, right? More memorable, brings up a more, you know, coherence like that. But yeah, when we dig into it, there'll be these changes that are really down at that level of switches, and switches are part of this too. Yeah, like that, right? So yeah, okay, right, like that. So we keep bringing those up, and sometimes somebody will bring it up and they'll say, yeah, it doesn't seem like much of a developmental change. And we'll be like, yep, might not be, but we will lean toward ones that are more dramatic than that. But that's a good one to talk about. You saw me, I was like, this is great, right? It's a great example to learn about. Yes, Madison.
Would it be appropriate for me to ask the class about what I'm thinking about for my capstone, whether or not that would be reasonable as an example?
Yeah, let's do that on Wednesday.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good point. That it's fine to bring out your capstone project and challenges and
I'd
things,
love to
and
know
just
what people think.
asking people about it. Yeah, right. Yes. Okay. Good. All right. But let's do that on Wednesday, and you can see we're going to kind of extend our discussion into Wednesday because we have like that. And it'll be a thing where I stand up in front, but I'll be like, and these are the slides that I got from here and there, and the students can chime in some like that. Yes. But so let's talk about that some on Wednesday. That would be great. And remind me to do that. Yep. So that's that. Good, I think, good example. And we described why it's a good example like that. Yeah. And it's really certainly satisfying knowledge for me, because I'm one of these organisms, like that. So thank you very much. Yes. So more about this topic.
It's great.
More about this topic. Oh yeah, well, you don't want to see that. And things look good. That's what I looked like when I was dancing. I'm like, get out of my way! And you're like, whoa, Professor Dave's on some kind of bender. And they're like, are you going to work tomorrow? And I'm like, what's that? All right, other things people want to mention about this topic, or bring up another one. Yeah. Okay, yes, let's talk about more stuff. What does somebody else want to mention about anything?
Chat about the reptiles.
All right, let's talk about reptiles. Great. And so I said Juliet and Luke both have stuff they sent me, and I added, some messages of that to kind of loop back. So let me just get to Luke. So Luke, pick this, and I'll post these on Brightspace. So if you want to go to the articles that the students picked, there's the link to Luke's article, like that. And again, whatever we talk about becomes part of the required for learning for our course. It could be example that I ask about on the exam, but I'll have it be not just what did Luke teach us, but rather what's this topic? Because we learned from the textbook about temperature-dependent sex determination. We learned from Juliet, like that. So, Luke, what do you want to say about the things you found?
Yeah, this article is probably more like or definitely is a review article like we were talking about earlier. So it encompasses a pretty wide range of temperature effect on reptiles. So they kind of start going through their effect results, and that's kind of where Dave was talking about earlier, where we're not really in that phenotypic plasticity range. And they have a good bit of knowledge as you kind of move through how it affects the developing embryos. And what they acknowledge is that there's no definitive evidence, that nobody has really deeply explored this topic yet, at least as of 2020. They were not able to say what is directly responsible for these changes in the eggs, but they were able to say that it probably occurs during differentiation in the embryos, and they know that because during embryogenesis they're able to see that difference in effect on the embryo. So if they let the eggs develop a little longer and then kind of expose it to those temperature changes, they wouldn't see as profound results. One of the notes they made that was kind of interesting to think about is that the variable in this case is continuous. We have like a very, it could be like 70 degrees or 71.5, and yet we have a binary response in the organism, which is kind of cool, I thought. And then if we get down to the mechanism, they kind of were exploring two hypotheses. One being hormones. Aromatase is an enzyme that we talked about and codes for the estrogens. And they say that as it gets a little hotter, there is more aromatase activity, and then we get the development of the female gametes, or gonads rather, ovaries. And then the other hypothesis is that we have some play from histone DNA methylation that affects the expression of various external genes.
Yep.
So there was a correlation between temperature and sex, but they didn't know if that was causing the sex.
We've observed the correlation between temperature and sex. The direct mechanism
is what
has
they know.
not been
Okay.
explicitly defined. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. So this is an example that's in our textbook, both in chapter 1 describing the idea, and in chapter 2 describing possible mechanisms like that. And so what scientists know is they understand the pathway, cellular and molecular pathway within a vertebrate for sex determination. So they know right away, oh, we're going to want to look at estrogen and testosterone. And Luke mentioned an enzyme called aromatase, which we mentioned already in our course, and the book does too. And aromatase is an enzyme that converts testosterone to estrogen. That's its enzymatic activity. So that would be an example of, well, you should look at that aromatase, okay? Like that. Yeah, Mike, you want to add something?
I just was looking at my notes and I wrote down something from chapter 1. It's slightly off topic from what you just said, but it's on topic for the whole class.
Yep.
And it was phenotypic plasticity is the ability of a single individual to change into more than one phenotype. So same genotype, multiple phenotypes. Then developmental plasticity is the same plasticity that I just mentioned above, but when seen in an embryo or larval stages. And that's what the book says.
Yep. Yeah, so
yeah.
that's good too. Yeah, it's a very good, help in defining, what we're talking about. Yep. Yep, great. Yep,
So
okay.
I would say yours is developmental plasticity, just based on that definition, developmental, physiological, just based on the definition from chapter 1.
Yeah.
Why would we talk about aging in this course?
See, I don't,
Everything's changing
yeah,
so rapidly.
so
Aging is part of development.
Not according to that definition.
not according to that definition.
Because the aging isn't
Yep.
in the embryonic stage, but what determines how you age developmentally. But that
Well,
would
maybe
be
that's
hereditary though. Yeah.
That's literally my paper with like everyone's always like behavior is physiological. My whole paper is synthesizing 30 different papers that talk about behavior being developmental. So it's like,
It's
but I was
going
just
to take more time for me to ensure that what I'm doing is developmental, not physiological, than it is for me to actually comprehend the content.
That's true.
your question is a really good question because like there really isn't an answer. Like you can almost like there are cases where it's like okay this one is developmental, like Luke's is developmental, like
I would show off.
for sure.
I should just pick the layout.
Something that's for sure developmental.
Yep.
I read somewhere else too that it was like pre-differentiation, like it's developmental. But then I was like, but then I also, no, I'm just saying the things I read because then I would still argue that you can make behavior developmental, and that's obviously post-differentiation.
Yep. All right. Great. So Luke also shared with me this data slide.
Yes.
And is this one species or multiple species?
I think they're looking specifically at a type of tortoise or something. Some sort of turtle.
And they're looking at the incubation temperature and aromatase expression,
Yes.
which I assume means, well, they're saying aromatase expression, which usually means like the amount of the enzyme, but I think they're probably hoping to refer to the overall activity of the enzyme because they have in parentheses estrogen concentration.
Could be, yes. When I read it, it did kind of sound like they were talking about the amount, and they sounded kind of as though they were alluding to that the increase in temperature causes a production of more aromatase.
Yep.
And thus an increase in estrogen concentration.
Yeah.
That's
Mhm.
kind of how I interpreted it
Mhm.
initially.
Yep, yeah. And so then, so there's more stuff we'll say about this, um, but from Luke, we heard a comment, which is they're trying to work out what is the molecular pathway. So it's well established that reptiles change sex, or not change sex, develop male or female depending on the incubation temperature. And so somewhere in here, it might be after what Juliet sent. I have a couple of overview slides that I wanted to share here. And so, I just saw Juliet's article first. So, we'll hear from Juliet too, probably not till Wednesday. But here, the book is showing this in chapter 1 and showing the sex ratio, so percentage males. So there would be where certain temperatures are 100% males. See that? So different species, and they show, the individual species show this sex determination based on temperature. So you see that there's a range of temperatures, they're saying, where males are produced. So in that alligator, that blue line, they're saying that males are produced at a really specific temperature, and cooler or warmer temperatures produce females.
That's the same kind of graph. From
Yeah, so in Luke's review paper, similar kind of graph, like that. So that is the phenomenon, that's the observation. And you can see there are different species-specific differences. That looks like a snapping turtle has a lower temperature, and then that turtle, was maybe not measured at lower temperatures like that, right? So it's different temperatures will produce males or females, and so just to kind of get into that at that level, there is a thing where we talked about sex determination some here. It was in a different setting. That's not temperature at all, but it's an environmental regulation of sex. And when we talk about any sex determination in any vertebrate, developmental biologists know a pathway really well. And of course, it's physiological features of the pathway, but it's a classic developmental pathway where it's going to be testosterone and estrogen. We're going to produce those. And so then Luke says they're struggling to determine the pathway. I think Juliet's article maybe comes down pretty hard on a pathway, because I think the situation is, again, we can learn more about it. I think the situation is that different scientists are studying different species, and they'd all be interested in the same overall pathway. They'd all be, you got to measure that aromatase. What's going on with the aromatase, like that, right? And so I think that maybe the message is that there isn't a clear single mechanism for all reptiles, right? And I would say I bet that's because these reptile species evolved this trait independently, separate times in evolution, where that turtle species or its turtle ancestors evolved it as a mechanism like that, right? And I think I have a little slide here that says somewhere in here, just this temperature-dependent sex determination. So let's just zoom out and think about that idea, right? So temperature sex determination is a type of environmental sex determination in which temperatures experienced by embryonic larval development determine sex of the offspring. It is observed in reptiles and teleos fish, with some reports of it occurring in shrimp. So that's a good start on this. Who would do that? And the answer is lots of reptiles and some fish, like that. So is there an example of that in mammals? Doesn't look like it based on Wikipedia, like that. So that brings us as biologists to thinking about a certain group of organisms like that, right? And then it says temperature sex differs from the chromosomal sex determination system common among vertebrates. It's the most studied type of environmental sex determination. Some other conditions, density, pH, environment, background color, also observed to alter sex ratios. We already have an example of that, right? The fish, right? So this is all really interesting because it says people study this reptile one a lot, right? And could be classified as either temperature dependent or temperature dependent. So but as sex determining mechanisms, temperature stability and genetism should be considered as in equivalent manner. So we should lump them all together, which can lead to reconsidering the status of fish species and so forth. So they're talking, both at the level of what organisms are doing this and how is it potentially different than some other stories of environmental affected sex determination, and how is it similar. And then Luke said something that I think is significant. So Luke said, I think, that these people are struggling to decide if it's really the temperature, what's the thermometer, the thermostat would be the thermostat here. So something that's important to bring up is, well, these are cold-blooded organisms, what is it, homeothermic? That their body's going to be the temperature. So who's detecting this in their bodies? And I think the big possibilities are, maybe it's the aromatase enzyme. And we'll talk about that. So the actual activity of the enzyme, like that, or maybe it's upstream or downstream mechanisms. So it could be like the stability of one hormone or the other, like that, or the production of an upstream gene, like that. Ashton's example is good because there's upstream mechanisms, that are the real switch, and you're just affecting downstream stuff. So where is temperature detection fit into this, like that? And so we just have a little bit of time left. No, we don't have any time left. So on Wednesday, we'll talk about that. Juliet was nodding a little bit about that, so can get that contribution. But I got good stuff from everybody, and so we'll keep talking. We won't sit in a circle, but we'll keep going through these examples because they're good examples. And and I agree with Mike that I'm trying to guide us to examples that are most, okay, I get a feeling for this, like that. Well, I think this is a good example of that, so we'll kind of lean into this a little bit more. And, that's how I'll deal with development and physiology, is I'll kind of lean into some examples more and less, others. But they're all good, and shouldn't be, we should keep discussing it. Like, we'll hear from Madison and talk about the Madison project and what do we think about, if that's one or the other. But we also, that's Emily and that's Madison.
No, so
we got to get out of here.
Madison to another girl in there.
Oh.
And then I have, in my other class with Rachel, there's 2 different Madisons.
Dang it. So let's
What's your last name?
yeah.
Strap.